Today's meeting is a West African press conference. So we encourage you to please introduce yourselves in the chat box if you can, so that we can recognize your presence and know who is in the call with us today. And to ensure inclusion of everyone, the press conference will hold both in English and French, and translating today will be Raimot Alagbe, who is based in Senegal. Thanks for being here, Raimot, too.
Bonjour à tous, bienvenue et merci d'avoir pris le temps de vous joindre à nous aujourd'hui pour la conférence de presse sur l'Afrique de l'Ouest organisée par la Glasgow Action Team et facilitée par Insightful Media. Veuillez bien vous présenter dans la boîte de discussion afin que nous puissions reconnaître votre présence. Pour des raisons d'inclusivité, la conférence de presse sera un mélange de langues françaises et anglaises. Donc, nous allons vous présenter un bref aperçu de l'ordre des événements. Nous ferons l'introduction en anglais et en français. Les orateurs liront le texte de la conférence de presse en anglais. Pendant ce temps, le lien vers la traduction française du texte sera déposé dans la boîte. Nous avons camarade Jake Hess et camarade Murphy qui sont présents, mais je crois nous avons également camarade Jonah qui a eu des imprévus, une urgence familiale, mais qui peut-être pourra nous joindre avant la fin de la séance. Thank you.
Just to run through how it's going to run, we will start with, to set the tone, we will start with Comrade Jake reading the text of a press conference that was articulated based on the thoughts of all the activists mentioned in the press conference. While that is being read, the French version will also be dropped in the chat box for our French colleagues to click a link and listen in French. After that, we'll do a question and answer segment where you can ask questions around what we've said so far.
Les orateurs aient donné le ton avec le texte de la conférence de presse, nous répondrons à vos questions. Pour gagner du temps, nous vous encourageons à écrire votre question dans la boîte de discussion ou à lever la fonction « Lever la main » pour indiquer si vous souhaitez prendre la parole. Maintenant, nous allons voir si camarade Jake est prêt pour son discours.
Comrade Jake, over to you, please.
Good afternoon, members of the press. Today, we join our voice to the global call for system change at the World Bank. This year's World Habitat Day seeks to draw attention to the growing inequalities and vulnerabilities that have been exacerbated by the triple C crises: COVID-19, climate, and conflict. And this is why we have converged here today to call on the World Bank to move from rhetoric to action and reform its climate policy. The World Bank was set up after World War II to rebuild economies, and its stated goals are to end extreme poverty by 2030 and to increase prosperity. The bank's failure to tackle climate change is the latest challenge where the bank has come up short and failed to deliver for low-income countries. Since the Paris Agreement, the World Bank has provided $12 billion in direct project finance to fossil fuel projects in more than 30 countries, which is more than any other multilateral development bank, according to civil society estimates. This figure does not include billions more in support of fossil fuels through financial intermediaries, the biggest culprit being the commercial lending arm of the World Bank, which is the International Finance Corporation, or IFC. False narration from the actual demands of global South citizens, especially Africans, who want clean, community-owned energy. Also harmful is the net zero lie that big polluters use to continue polluting while promising unrealistic tree planting schemes that could only feasibly lead to land grabs. The World Bank is operating with impunity. The vast proportion of the World Bank's lending and other program portfolios remain immune from legal actions, as does the IMF. This means that its contradictions are not held accountable. For example, It continues to invest in fossil fuels, which are driving climate change, at the same time as investing in trying to fix the problems caused by climate change, such as investing $10 million into reversing degradation of Lake Chad. In Nigeria, a current major concern is that the bank has announced funding for carbon capture and storage, a controversial and unproven technology that claims to store carbon underground to help Nigeria reach its emissions targets, despite criticisms that this techno fix reinforces fossil fuel dependence. The project is geared toward research and piloting. In his speech at the last UN climate talks, President Buhari announced that Nigeria would become net zero by 2060, saying, quote, "The government is looking for partners, technology, and finance to make cleaner and efficient use of all available resources for a more stable transition in energy markets. But it's crucial that the technologies are scientifically proven, given the number of false solutions that are promoted by greenwashing lobbyists and financiers." Nigeria, as a major oil producer, wants to prolong the status quo as much as possible. Last year, the vice president wrote an article denouncing growing calls for fossil fuel divestment. Nigeria's climate policy heavily relies on so-called carbon sinks, meaning the country plans to keep burning fossil fuels, but supposedly remove the emissions after they've been produced, presumably through carbon capture and storage and other unrealistic solutions, like planting trees. The risk of carbon capture and storage is that it provides a pretext to continue burning fossil fuels instead of switching to clean energy. The science is clear that we need to rapidly transition away from fossil fuels if we want to achieve a safe climate for all. Obviously, the fossil fuel industry doesn't want to do that, so they tell us to give them money for carbon capture instead. Carbon capture is a totally unproven solution. In a recent op-ed co-authored by an MIT scientist, Charles Harvey and Hurt House, they detailed how carbon capture has failed in the USA and distracted from real solutions. No wonder the World Bank's Climate Action Plan makes a few passing references to it, using weasel words to the effect that carbon capture may be a solution. That's the bank's way of acknowledging there's absolutely no proof of concept for the idea. The science is clear. The world is on a countdown to climate catastrophe if it does not cut carbon emissions. It's now or never. The World Bank is a major investor of public money into energy projects and sets the norms for other multilateral lenders and crowds in private finance, so it is essential that those running the World Bank acknowledge the real-world impact of its funding. The World Bank is presided over by David Malpass, appointed in 2019 by the climate-denying Trump administration, which rolled back 100 environmental protections. The appointment of the president of the World Bank is always made undemocratically and illegitimately via a so-called gentleman's agreement between the United States and Europe. It's time to update both the job description and selection process to guarantee leadership that is fit for purpose. And here are some recommendations from civil society organizations. Having raised our concerns on our observations, this is what we would like to see. A future-fit World Bank must genuinely help to reduce carbon emissions by shifting financing from fossil fuels to renewables and prepares workforces to operate a clean economy. To achieve this, the bank must stop using public money to bankroll dirty polluters. That means signing the Glasgow Clean Energy Statement for the next UN climate conference, leave fossil fuels in the ground. They should also close loopholes allowing private lenders and asset managers to continue extracting and exploiting fossil fuels. We also ask the World Bank to align all with poverty alleviation at its heart. The bank must prioritize investment in Global South renewable energy projects with civil society input toward publicly owned, democratically controlled systems that serve the common good instead of private profit. The World Bank must stop hoarding its reserves and mobilize $1 trillion in new, genuinely green finance. Move away from an extractive model of financing towards delivering a just transition through investments which benefit people on the poverty line instead of the 1%. Evaluate impact through the lens of sustainability, equity, and justice, and actively champion an independent body to restructure sovereign debt. And finally, we want the World Bank to raise ambition so that half of all World Bank financing is on climate adaptation and mitigation, given the scale and urgency of this crisis. Candidates for World Bank leadership should be accountable and committed to scientific evidence. So that is the text together. I personally live in Washington, D.C., and I'm happy to read the statement on their behalf. And I'm honored to be with them today to support their calls for reforming the World Bank to become a climate bank that we need rather than a bank for the 1% and for the fossil fuel industry.
Maintenant, répondre à vos questions en anglais et en français. Pour les francophones, vous pouvez laisser vos questions dans la boîte de discussion ou vous pouvez également utiliser l'option lever la main si vous souhaitez prendre la parole. Merci. Thank you. Pendant que camarade Jake faisait son discours, nous avons posté le lien pour la version française du texte et nous avons également envoyé un lien pour le texte de la conférence en français et en anglais. Donc, vous pouvez tout retrouver dans la boîte de discussion. Maintenant, si vous avez des questions, vous pouvez les prendre la parole. Merci. Donc, nous avons envoyé le lien pour pouvoir gagner du temps parce que s'il fallait faire la traduction après le discours, ça pourrait nous prendre plus de temps. Donc, pendant que camarade Jake s'exprimait, les autres francophones écoutaient la version française sur YouTube. Thank you.
Next one question here from Imor. Do we think governments are doing enough? Do we think governments are doing enough in the implementation of agreements in cutting emissions?
No, I don't think governments are doing enough to cut emissions. And I would specify that the climate crisis was really caused by governments and corporations and wealthy people in the richest countries. And because they caused the crisis, it is also primarily, mainly, their responsibility to address the crisis. And should I wait for translation or should I just keep going?
Please keep going. We'll summarize.
Yeah.
Please keep going, Jake. Thank you.
And of course, low-income countries need a lot of help when it comes to cutting emissions and to switching to green energy. The World Bank is an institution which should be helping them do that. My understanding is that countries in the global south want clean energy for their people. They want clean, equitable developments, but they need money to make it happen. And the assistance that they need is not forthcoming right now. One of the reasons that the assistance is not forthcoming is that the institution that is supposed to help them, the World Bank, is missing in action. The World Bank is an organization that was founded to help reduce poverty and increase prosperity. As a result of that, they have a major important role to play in addressing the climate crisis. They have a lot of money, a lot of expertise, and a lot of other resources that other institutions just don't have. Sadly, the World Bank right now is not capable of meeting its obligations and its potential at this moment. And I would argue that that failure begins at the very top. The president of the World Bank, as we mentioned at the very beginning, was appointed by Donald Trump, who led one of the most destructive reactionary administrations in the recent history of the United States. And just a few weeks ago, the World Bank president was asked by the New York Times if he agrees that fossil fuels caused the climate crisis. And he said he didn't know because he's not a scientist. So basically, we have a climate denier at the head of the World Bank at a time when we desperately need its money and its resources to make the green energy transition happen. And in the subsequent weeks, the World Bank president tried to walk back his comments and say that, oh, I misspoke. I was inarticulate. It was a mistake. We know that's a lie because he's been on the record as a climate denier for a long time. 10 years ago, he said the same thing that he said at the New York Times 2 weeks ago. So again, to answer the question, no, governments are not doing enough. The main responsibility lies with rich countries, and the rich countries have to give all the money and all of the support they can to poor countries to help them make that transition to clean energy and to cut emissions. Sadly, the World Bank is not doing that right now because they're run by a climate denier and they're imprisoned by the US political system. So getting on track, I would say, begins with finding new leadership for the World Bank that is actually up to the challenges of the moment.
Gemma here says, hi Jake, you have worked at the World Bank. Did you experience the institution understanding any negative impact it has on the environment? What should campaigners do to get them to understand?
I live in Washington, D.C., and I worked at the World Bank for 7 years as a researcher in the Development Economics Research Group. I worked at the World Bank because I wanted to make a positive difference for global poverty and for environmental justice. Sadly, I eventually realized that the World Bank was not the right place to pursue those goals. And last year, I decided to go public and to write an article criticizing the World Bank president and the institution as a whole for its failure to lead on the climate crisis. As a result of that, I lost my job. So that's just the background that Gemma is referring to right now. And I had to do that, I felt, because it was clear that the World Bank, under the current president, David Malpass, is not capable of responding to the climate crisis. He came out with a climate action plan in the year 2021 that does not commit to phasing out support for fossil fuels and does not mobilize enough money to actually help countries transition towards clean energy. And sadly, the World Bank's internal mechanisms for reform are not functioning. Managerial corruption, managerial inaction means that the voices of the staff cannot be heard internally. And so as a result of that, I felt like I had no choice but to speak out. Whenever the World Bank has made progress on environmental issues, on any issues, it's been because of campaigning and grassroots organizing and activism all over the world, and especially in poor countries. This activism is what we need to bring pressure on governments so they feel like they have no choice but to lead on climate and to lead on behalf of the world's people rather than the 1%. And since all of you are you're all media workers, the media also has a very important role to play in telling the truth about the climate crisis and what the World Bank actually is doing and what it should be doing. We hear a lot here in Washington, D.C. that the decisions at the World Bank get made because of what low-income countries want, and it's all up to them, and the United States and Europe are just passive observers. They say we have to keep funding fossil fuels because that's what low-income countries want. And so, it's up to them to change their tune. Others have, and it's really cynical to see them pretending to care about what low-income countries want when they have such a long history of trampling on these countries when it suits them to do so. So I think media can be part of the solution, tell the truth about the climate crisis, tell the truth about what the people want, report fairly and accurately on the World Bank's activities. Remember, these are public institutions that are supposed to serve the public good. They're here to serve us, the people of the world, not the 1% and not the fossil fuel industry. The media needs to hold them to that mission. And also, don't let people like David Malpass or the US government or the European governments claim to speak for low-income countries, because they're doing that now, and they're claiming that all the low-income countries want fossil fuels, which in my view, is not the case at all. So don't let them do that. Speak out and tell the truth.
Je vais d'abord vous traduire la première réponse que camarade Jake a donnée pour la question de camarade Emo, qui demandait si le gouvernement fait assez pour la lutte contre le changement climatique. Et camarade Jake nous a répondu non, le gouvernement, en réponse, la Banque mondiale et le gouvernement n'en font pas assez. La Banque mondiale doit faire plus et assurer la réduction des émissions de carbone. Par rapport à la deuxième question que camarade Jake vient de répondre, je vous fais un résumé très bref pour aller vraiment vite. Donc, en ce qui concerne la deuxième question, camarade Jack vient de nous répondre que les gouvernements ne font pas assez et les pays les plus pauvres qui souffrent, et c'est les pays les plus pauvres qui souffrent le plus. Il appelle le monde à aider et à jouer un rôle important.
Essentially, what is the Glasgow Action Team doing to incentivize the government to cut down and improve on their carbon footprint? Yeah. And then another question from Comrade Gabriel also talks about what is the key message that the Glasgow Action Team is taking to COP27 in Egypt. I think we'll take those two first and then we'll come back to more questions. Merci.
So I can't speak really on behalf of the Glasgow Action Team. I can't speak on behalf of any organization, but I am a climate activist. I am involved in these issues, so I can share some thoughts. In terms of what we're doing for high emitting countries in Africa and Asia, I think most climate activists in wealthy countries like the United States, which is where I live, would say that, in our opinion, the climate crisis was really caused by wealthy countries and wealthy people in wealthy countries, and therefore that's where we have to focus. Practically speaking, as an American citizen, I focus on the United States because, at least nominally, the United States is a democratic country and the leaders are supposed to respond to people like me. So I have the ability to make a positive change in the United States, and that's where I focus. When it comes to what's happening in Asian and African countries, I see my role as to encourage the United States through institutions like the World Bank to provide more funding to Asian and African countries so they can accelerate the clean energy transition and get away from fossil fuels as fast as possible. And it's also important to state that people like me, people in global civil society generally, try to support activists in global south countries, whether they're in Africa, Asia, or somewhere else, and to elevate their voices to the global stage to the extent that we can. And I think today's press conference is an example of that. Unfortunately, it seems like we've had some difficulty with the network connection, so some our Nigerian colleagues have been unable to join us so far, but we think it's important for climate activists, ordinary people all over the world to come together to demand our governments do what's necessary to deal with the climate crisis in a way that is truly fair and just and equitable. And in terms of the message going into COP27, we need the governments of rich countries to get serious about tackling the climate crisis. And we need them to be serious about meeting their obligations to low-income countries, which need money and expertise and support in moving away from fossil fuels and towards clean energy. And the institution that should be leading that transition is the World Bank. The World Bank was established to deal with problems like this. Sadly, they're not meeting their potential. And that failure begins at the very top with David Malpass, who is a climate denier who said 2 weeks ago that he doesn't know if fossil fuels cause climate change, which is the same thing basically as denying the climate crisis. It is completely absurd and ridiculous in the year 2022 to have a climate denier leading the institution. So my request would be to the US and European governments and governments all over the world to get rid of this climate denier and rebuild the World Bank so it can actually deal with the problems we're facing on an equitable and fair basis, instead of denying the problems, which is what they're doing now.
Donc, nous avons camarade Jake qui vient de répondre à d'abord une première question. Et pour, en ce qui concerne la question du COP27, qu'est-ce que la conférence apporte à la lutte contre le changement climatique? Donc, le COP27 a besoin que les gouvernements les plus puissants prennent la situation au sérieux, prennent le problème au sérieux, surtout les gouvernements des États-Unis, par exemple, et qu'ils agissent. Ils doivent, et les institutions qui pourraient pousser les gouvernements à prendre ce problème au sérieux sont les institutions comme la Banque mondiale, et ils devraient encourager ces gouvernements à soutenir les pays d'Afrique, les pays les plus pauvres, les pays les plus démunis, et résoudre une fois de bon ce problème de changement climatique au lieu de les nier. Donc, en revenant à la première question, les instituts comme la Banque mondiale doivent fournir plus de fonds. Ils doivent fournir plus de fonds pour résoudre les problèmes. Je pense que la séance d'aujourd'hui est une façon de contribuer à l'atteinte de cet objectif-là. Certes, nous n'avons que quelques pays qui sont présents, mais c'est déjà un premier pas. Si le message peut arriver jusqu'à la Banque mondiale, on pourrait parler d'un début pour en finir avec les problèmes de changement climatique. Thank you.
Merci. We have a question in French in the chat box for inclusion. I think we should take that next.
Okay. Ma question est de savoir, est-ce qu'aujourd'hui, il ne faut pas, les pays du continent africain n'attendent plus les financements d'ailleurs qui ne viennent pas depuis des années malgré des annonces et les alertes de gravité des conséquences des changements climatiques, et partir vers des actions et financements disponibles sur le continent. Okay, so here, Comrade Alpha is asking if we shouldn't actually consider financing actions that are available in the continent instead of waiting for those countries, those powerful countries, always promising to bring their help, but not really taking action. Why not use what we have here to try to resolve the problem? Thank you.
Okay, that sounds like a contribution, not a question, if I'm correct.
Is Imo here. I'm with West Africa Democracy Radio in Dakar, Senegal. Just to emphasize on the question asked by my colleague from the French service, Abubakar, he was asking, why can't the countries on the continent use the resources available to fight climate change instead of waiting for the rich and wealthy nations, that we are claiming are responsible for, this emissions. So he's asking, why can't, or what is stopping the countries on the continent in using what they have to start, these activities before the likes of the World Bank, the FDB, and the rest of them can come in to support. Thank you.
Thank you, Imor. And I would speak to that. I haven't worked with on this particular campaign for years. I've been to Niger Delta. I have seen firsthand the issues going on there. And we are all also familiar, at least for Nigeria, for instance, the level of debt the country has. So of course, when you ask government to fund anything of this initiative, they always tell you there's no funds. ASU on strike, for instance. Across Africa, the situation is almost the same thing. Governments will say they have multiple projects to fund and they don't have money to fund it. So they need to get more money from the World Bank, more debts. So while this is supposed to be the ideal situation, where governments are looking inwards, generating their resources inwardly and solving their own problems, sadly, the situation we still have in Africa, in most global South countries, is dependent on foreign investments. And we're hoping that that changes, but of course, it's not about just talking about it. It's about working around, supporting these governments to also look inward.
Thank you. Donc, camarade Lola répond à la question de camarade Alpha qui demande pourquoi, qu'est-ce qui empêche le gouvernement de fournir les fonds pour résoudre les problèmes de changement climatique. Donc, selon camarade Lola, déjà des demandes de fonds se font au niveau du gouvernement, mais à chaque fois le gouvernement dit avoir des manques de fonds, avoir beaucoup de situations à régler et qu'il faut toujours faire recours à la banque, à une demande à la Banque mondiale pour régler les problèmes. Il ne s'agit pas seulement également de demander au gouvernement d'agir, mais nous sommes aussi censés soutenir le gouvernement pour atteindre ces objectifs-là. Donc, pour la part de camarade Lola, c'est ce qu'elle pourrait répondre à cette question. Thank you.
Merci. Gemma, we see your hand is up. If you have a question or you have a contribution, you can also unmute and speak.
Thank you. I was just hoping to add a point about national governments and their climate action plans, because indeed it should be the responsibility of any president or prime minister to take responsibility for climate action in their own country. And with the case of Nigeria, it's interesting that a lot of the climate plans reflect these net zero plans that are increasingly popular with both governments and corporations. But obviously, we need to be really clear what is actually genuinely going to help the climate crisis. And we are very clear with our campaign that we really need to be focusing on reducing emissions, whereas there are lots of kind of greenwashing initiatives and lots of loopholes that are being promoted by, not only the World Bank, but by lobbyists that work for the oil, gas and coal industries. And, net zero is just one of them. If you take a company like Shell, for example, we were looking at some research that a partner organization, ActionAid, actually did, which was that, if Shell were to actually achieve its own net zero targets, it would need land 3 times the size of the Netherlands where it's registered in order to plant enough trees to actually offset the carbon that would that amount of kind of tree planting schemes. It's obviously totally unfeasible without creating loads of land grabbing scenarios in the global south. So it's just an example of the amount of kind of greenwashing that goes on. And I think what our campaign is trying to highlight is that a lot of the advice that comes from the World Bank is quite frankly uninformed, and it's really, really influential over governments and their climate action plans and the UN climate talks. So with the recent investment that was announced in February, the World Bank is pumping millions through the Nigerian government to research carbon capture. And that is a totally unproven technology about, suggesting that you can continue to emit carbon into the atmosphere and then you can pull it back and bury it underground. I mean, the risks associated with relying on that as your climate action plan as a government are huge. It's much better to actually reduce emissions. And that's a key point that is often pushed aside because of this lobbying that goes on from the oil industry. And because of the World Bank being run by people like David Malpass that doesn't actually believe that human impact and fossil fuels are causing global warming. So really, I just wanted to kind of highlight that point, because I think that we're not saying that we should wait around for rich countries to, take action. But what we're saying is that there should be a level of truth in the kind of technology and in the science and in the research that goes into developing a climate strategy that is co-owned by the global North and South.
Thank you.
Donc, je disais tantôt que nous avons camarade Gemma qui a donné son point de vue par rapport à la situation, et elle répondait tout de suite que voilà, la crise à laquelle les pays sont confrontés, en fait, est que avec l'investissement en février, la Banque mondiale injecte des millions dans la recherche, en particulier au Nigeria. Le point clé est de réduire l'émission de carbone. Nous ne disons pas que nous devrions attendre des pays. Ils devraient avoir un niveau de vérité dans la recherche, dans le développement d'une stratégie de réclamation. Donc, en bref, voilà les points essentiels qui ont été mentionnés. Thank you.
Why is your organization focusing on World Bank? Can you explain more about their role in climate change? Okay, that's been explained by Gemma in terms of they are in the position to influence investments in climate.
Une question posée qui demandait pourquoi est-ce que l'organisation est beaucoup plus focalisée sur la Banque mondiale. Eh bien, la réponse qui a été donnée par camarade Gemma est que la Banque mondiale est en position d'influence sur les gouvernements. La Banque mondiale est l'institution la plus à même de pouvoir influencer les gouvernements afin qu'ils puissent agir, afin que voilà, des démarches puissent être menées. Elle est la plus puissante, en fait, qui puisse véritablement aider pour l'atteinte de ces objectifs. Merci.
We just want to say thank you for being here. Being someone on ground in terms of speaking on this matter and the level of injustice is going on at the grassroots. It's painful that Comrade Murphy and Jonah are not here today, sadly, but I wish they were here to share what they've shared with me in terms of their personal experiences and how this hits home for them and how this affects their communities. Yeah, I recall going to Niger Delta and meeting a woman who was sick. She couldn't stand, she couldn't walk because of the water she has been drinking. The water is polluted. And amongst other things, farmland's gone, a whole lot more. I'm sure we all in Nigeria are not, this is not new to us. This is not a new subject to us. But I'm just saying this for the benefit of those that are not Nigerian or don't have the context for for Nigeria and Niger Delta. But basically, we are just saying that the carbon capture and storage is not a sustainable solution to the situation. And if the World Bank claims that, I mean, if you check World Bank's social media pages, their LinkedIn, their Instagram, you see them talking about how they are investing in climate and what they're doing to see that we have a sustainable climate and environment. However, how can you say you're doing that and then behind the scene, you're also working with multinationals and polluters and investing in them? So it's double standard, and we are all just speaking today to say we don't want that to happen, not in Nigeria, not in any African country, not in any global South country. And that's just the crux of today's conversation. We thank you for your time, and we'll be sharing the resources with you after now, but please feel free to email us or ask us any further questions as COP27 comes up. I mean, it's coming up shortly in the next couple of weeks, months. And I mean, we'll be there, we'll be doing a lot around that. So we will continue to engage with you on the subject and hope that as the media, the power to shape conversation and to shape actions and policies, we wield that power responsibly, and we are able to influence in some ways.